All right.
So in this video, we're going to show you how to cut linoleum and how to use the carving tools. In class, I'm going to be showing you and helping you transfer, zoom in a little bit, transfer an image onto your linoleum. This is why you really want the porous, absorbent linoleum, not the rubbery stuff. Now the way you transfer that is we're going to use a cleaning agent / solvent called Citrusol, and we're going to take a laser print from our laser printer, fairly fresh. We're going to put the laser print face down. We're going to apply a little Citrusol to the back, and then we're going to run that through the press to apply pressure. That Citrusol dissolves the plastic toner on the laser print and transfers it to the linoleum. So that's what you're seeing right here and right there, is that little bit of transferred image. So if you have a digital file of the image you want to carve, you can print that on our laser printer. We'll transfer that down, and because we're transferring it face down, it's already going to be wrong reading on the block because it was right reading on the laser print. So then looking at the image, your image on the block, you'll be like, oh, it's backwards. But it's backwards here so that when you make your final relief print, it'll be right reading again, okay? So that's how we're gonna initially get the image onto the linoleum. At that point, it's not a horrible idea to redraw things with a Sharpie. You don't absolutely have to, but the transferred laser print will not be quite as durable on the block as a Sharpie mark. So if you're ever planning an image where you're going to be really roughly carving for long periods of time and you really don't want to lose any detail, it's laborious, but you should actually draw over the transfer with Sharpie. The Sharpie also has the advantage of being darker, so it would be a little bit easier to see while you're carving. The final advantage of the Sharpie, if you do that, is that inevitably there's going to be little details where the transfer is not perfect, and or maybe you've got so much detail packed in that it's hard to distinguish on the transfer. And keep in mind that you're not going to be able to carve crazy amounts of detail on this. You're limited. You're limited in the experience and skill that you currently have, and you're limited in what the linoleum can hold, and you're limited in time. So you may have too much stuff, and if you don't clarify it beforehand and you just think, well, I'm just going to wing it while I am carving, then it really won't turn out well. So the big advantage of the Sharpie and redrawing is it forces you to make decisions about where is the black ink going to print and where is it not going to print. So that's one of the big advantages. If you zoom in right there, that transferred image is too much detail. I would not be able to carve that into the linoleum I have there. So I've told you guys in class, I want you to choose a detail and enlarge it. And I've showed you some examples from other students about doing that. But if you come in and you show me this, I'm going to say, that's probably too much detail, because A, I can't even really see some of the finer aspects in the transfer on the block, and B, even if I could see it, I probably couldn't carve it that fine because of the nature of the linoleum. This one, if you look here, this has been digitally altered, a photograph that's been digitally altered to add these lines. So that is right on the borderline. I mean, that could technically be carved. So that's a level of detail that you could actually put into the block. there. So anyway, the sequence will be, we're going to transfer with the Citrusol. You might want to show me your block, and I'll give you a personal recommendation should you draw with the Sharpie or not. And then, the next step before you carve is also optional, although I recommend it. And I have grabbed a random red-ish screen printing ink. So this is an acrylic ink. It is not quite the same as acrylic paint. It's very close, but it's actually not quite as waterproof when it's dry. This is just speedball screen printing ink. The idea is that if I carve this right now, see if I just carve a chunk out, I can sort of see my carving mark, but it's difficult to see. So if I'm carving in my image, it's hard to tell the difference visually between where I've carved and where I haven't carved because it's the same gray linoleum. So the idea is that we can, after getting our image done and we love the way it looks and we're ready to start carving, we stain the entire block with another color. And we just stain it. We're not like painting a coat on, we're just staining it so that where we carve, we'll see the gray linoleum, and where we have not carved, we see the stain, and where we do not want to carve, we see the black. Hope that makes sense. So I'm going to just get a little bit on the tip of a paper towel. I'm going to go ahead and grab a second paper towel that's going to be for buffing it in, because I'll use this just to apply it. So I'll just kind of set it around. I don't want to try to do too much at once. I just want to, and this should be done before you start carving. So I apply wet ink, kind of thick, to a certain area, and then I need to go in and buff it and remove all the excess. Now there was already a few carving marks in there. I should try to dig that screen ink out of there. You won't have that problem because the whole idea is to stain this before you carve. So now that already should be pretty dry. Now when I carve this, I see two colors. I see the gray of the linoleum itself, and it stands out nicely from the stained portion. So I can tell the difference between the black, where I do not want to carve, because again, relief printing, where you leave it raised and flat, that's where it's going to print black. So I don't want to carve the black. I want to carve around the black, but I also need to know how much progress I've made. So the stain will show me how much there is still to carve, and the gray tells me what I've carved. So I'm going to apply a little bit over here too. So you'll see it on this side. When you're staining the block, you definitely want to avoid any texture in this ink on the surface. So it's important that you buff off any brush marks or daubs or quantity like that. You just want it to function as a stain. You can see that here, a little spot that was already carved, I didn't push the screen ink into that carving quite as much, and so you see the lighter gray in there. So once I've stained it, and it's dry to the touch, although there's still moisture in there. I think I'd probably want to hit this with the hairdryer for a minute or two to make sure it's fully dry, or just let it sit for about 20 minutes. Although it is probably fine to immediately go into the carving. Now for the carving, you're going to be using this basic speedball set that that comes like this, and I'm already getting a little issue that'll be good for you to see. So every once in a while, a nib can get locked in. It was locked in there for a second. So when you buy it, it comes like this. You got the various nibs, and you got this thing. The butt of the handle unscrews, and you can store the nibs in there. Be careful with these. There is a sharp end, and there's a non-sharp end. The non-sharp end is always the same, regardless of the shape of the sharp end. And this curve is not for the carving, that's for inserting into the handle. So you have a small V gouge, you have a big V gouge, and V for just the shape of the blade. Here you have a big, deep U gouge, a kind of squared off U gouge that is even a little bit bigger, and a wider U gouge. So that's what this set comes with, plus the knife. The knife is probably either going to be used the least or not at all. So you could keep it, but you probably won't use it much. Now the first one I'll probably start with is the very smallest V gouge, so for detail. That's going to be good for detail. So I take the end that goes into the handle, I loosen this just a little bit. You know, I can tighten this all the way down, and that locks all that stuff in place. So I could loosen that a little bit, and then you'll see that if you look in there, there's a way. Well, let me open it up. It'll make it a little bit easier to see. So there's two pieces in there, and they fit together like that. And the nib goes between those two inside that thing. So it would go like that. And you can see how the curve of the nib is held in place in there. By tightening this down onto that, it applies pressure to this, holding it. So if this ever comes off, you just take these two, put them together properly. This is the front end there. Drop it in like that, and then screw it on. But don't tighten it all the way down. So then you can insert that in there, tighten this down, and now it won't come out. It's a very, very basic tool, okay? So that's how we're going to use it. You do want to be careful. These are blades. They are not the best quality blades. This is not the best quality steel, but this will be adequate for what we're doing with the carving of linoleum. The way you want to hold it as much as possible. Different people have different ways, although I think the best way would be something like this. You're holding it like that. Frankly, for my hand, this handle is a tiny bit too long. I suspect for a lot of you that will be true as well. But I like to keep an index finger on the edge of the nib, right like that, and keep this as much as possible parallel with the line of my forearm. So I'm not holding it like this or like this. I'm holding it like that. When I carve, I'm right-handed, so I'm going to turn my torso a little bit so the right side is closer to the table, like this. If I were left-handed, I would do the opposite. I would be like this. The reason is when I'm carving, as much as possible, try to brace the elbow of the arm you're using to carve. Your other hand is going to help control the block. You're probably going to cut yourself on this project. It's just a question of how bad. I need to cut into the linoleum, but not super deeply. There are ways. I'm not going to show you a video of sharpening these tools, but I'm happy to show you in class for sharpening the tool. So if you think that maybe your tool needs to be sharpened a little bit, and that's a big deal, it makes a big difference, then let me know and we can sharpen them in class. So this is kind of the position I want to be in here. This little image I showed you there, these are all just straight lines. That's really easy to carve. With the nature of the V or U gouges, the deeper I go into the linoleum, the wider the line's going to be, and the shallower I carve, the thinner the line's going to be. So I might start at one end like that, and I could just, and notice how I'm using my index finger, my right index finger, to make contact with the block. And you see I get that little ribbon of linoleum. And now I have that light gray stain showing me where I carved. Because I don't need the depth to be very much, you know, I can stick my finger in there. That's going to print just fine. I don't need a whole bunch of depth to those cuts. My glasses are fogging up. So that would be just fine. And if I did the next, I would just keep going. So straight lines obviously are pretty easy. But what about if I have a curve? So let's say I have this kind of apostrophe form. I'm drawing this on top of the stain. You can do that, but it would have been better to draw it first and then stain it. So let's say I have that kind of apostrophe form and I want that to print, okay? I have to carve around that. And that's get a little bit more challenging because it's not a straight line. Some people will intuitively want to start with like one side and they're gonna do this with their arm. But as soon as I get out like about here, I'm going to start losing control. I won't be able to control what the blade is doing. I only have control when I'm in this position. So the trick is, instead of moving your arm around the curve, you move the block. Now when I was carving that straight line, you might have seen my left hand was either beside the tool or behind it. That's nice and safe. You should not have your hand in front of where you're carving. A guarantee of you carving the block is that sometimes your blade is going to slip. You're going to come out of linoleum when you're applying force and it's going to slip forward like that. If you've braced your elbow, you will slip not as far. But if you don't have your elbow braced, you're going to slip quite a bit. So because of that, you would never want to hold the block with your other hand directly in front of the blade. You want it on the side or behind, whatever is possible. Once in a while you might see my hand creep out to like this, but I definitely don't want it right in front of where I'm carving. I may also spider my hand like that so that if I do slip, I have a good chance that the blade misses my hand. This is where you're going to end up cutting yourself right here, because you're going to forget this and you're going to have your hand like that and you're going to slip and you're going to drive the tool right into your other hand like that. So that's fairly easy, straight lines. Now that with the curved, it's a little bit different. But I'm going to start with my left hand like this. Oops, I slipped a little bit. So I'm going to turn the block as I go. This on the inside of the curve, I can just bring it back the opposite way. So I'm going all the way around that black apostrophe form with my smallest V-gouge nib, and because I've stained the block, I can easily see where I've carved and where I haven't, and I can see the black where I want it to print and not be carved at all. And now I'm going back and making that carving mark a little bit wider around the apostrophe form, just to give me a little more space. And again, these marks do not have to be deep at all. So let's say that apostrophe form was going to be out by itself in the middle of nothing. And so now that I've carved the basic form of that, I might put a wider U-gouge in that will remove linoleum much faster. But I won't be able to do as much detail with this wide U-gouge. So that's why I started with the small V-gouge and then came back with this. Okay. So get a close-up of that, and you can see how I started first with the small V-gouge, went all the way around it, and then I went with the larger one by changing out the nib. Of course, you can also try different textures too. So I can establish value just by kind of cutting away a certain proportion. It's almost like you could think about the grays as percentages, like what percentage of the flat surface is going to print and what percentage is not going to print. So, you know, you can create tones that way as well. And the different tools, the nibs get kind of locked in. If it gets really, really locked in, I find I have to grip the side with a pair of pliers and pull it out that way. This set doesn't have a really shallow U-gouge. I kind of wish it did, but a really shallow U-gouge, I could make a series of scalloped marks like this. So you have to kind of think about what direction the mark is going to go if you're using the gesture of the carving tool, because that will indicate volume and surface of the thing you're depicting. But you also have to think about how dense it is and how much surface, how much ink am I actually going to have printing in there. And you know, having carved with one tool, you can mix and go back to a different one and go over the same area. It can be kind of hard to carve over a carved portion, but if you're careful, you can do it. So again, any amount I carve off is not going to print, and that is a way to create value. This digitized image creates value by changing the width of the line. So as the black lines get wider, we read that as a darker gray. As the black lines get thinner, we read it as a lighter gray. And that would simply translate, because when the white lines are really big, I would carve away more. to where very little of the surface is printing. And then I barely carve anyway when I need it to be a dark gray. It's kind of fun. I mean, it would never escape its digital sort of nature, but it's kind of a cool way of thinking about an image. Okay, I think that covers the basics of carving. If you're carving up in the shop, make sure all this stuff gets swept up and put into the garbage. That's super important. I think that's it.